Honestly, I'm physically exhausted just thinking about the sheer audacity it takes to hand someone a brightly colored, aggressively laminated citation in 110-degree heat. I mean, literally, who has the energy for that kind of petty tyranny? Which is exactly why sovereign justice exists in the first place. Anyway, let's just dive into it.
The heat radiating off my concrete driveway was intense enough to warp the air, making the impeccably manicured lawns of the Desert Bloom subdivision look like they were melting into a sad, beige puddle. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Scottsdale, Arizona. The sun wasn't just shining, it was actively trying to assassinate anything stupid enough to stand outside without SPF 500 and a personal hydration system. I was standing there in a pair of gym shorts and a t-shirt that was rapidly adhering to my spine, blinking sweat out of my eyes. And there she was. Brenda, the president of the Desert Bloom Homeowners Association, standing on my property line like a sentinel of suburban misery. She was wearing a perfectly crisp, pastel yellow capri set that somehow completely defied the laws of thermodynamics. She wasn't sweating. I'm not entirely convinced she breathed oxygen. In her manicured French-tipped hand, she held a neon pink piece of paper. It wasn't just paper, though. It was aggressively, thickly laminated, catching the brutal Arizona sun and reflecting it directly into my corneas. It was an official HOA citation, and the plastic coating meant she intended for this thing to survive a nuclear blast. I wiped a sheet of sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a greasy streak across my brow. I had been inside, minding my own business, enjoying the sweet, artificial chill of my central air conditioning. My AC unit had been working overtime for the last 3 months, a necessary evil in a place where the ambient temperature routinely rivals the surface of Mercury. Last July, my electric bill had hit an astronomical, soul-crushing $600. $600 just to maintain a living environment that didn't induce heat stroke while watching Netflix. So, being a rational human being, living in a state that receives approximately 360 days of unfiltered, blistering sunlight a year, I made an investment. I hired a highly rated, licensed, and bonded local company to install a state-of-the-art photovoltaic solar array on my south-facing roof. They were beautiful. Sleek, low-profile, black-on-black, monocrystalline panels that hugged the roofline so tightly you practically had to be standing on my chimney to see them from the street. They were quiet, they were efficient, and they were going to pay for themselves in 4 years. They were the epitome of modern, responsible home ownership. Brenda did not agree, but she thrust the laminated pink rectangle toward my chest. I didn't take it immediately. I just stared at it, then up at her meticulously hair-sprayed bob. "I'm not playing games, Dave," Brenda said, her voice carrying that specific nasal pitch of a woman who spends her weekends measuring her neighbor's grass with a clear plastic ruler. "This is your third and final warning. They need to come down." "Brenda," I sighed, my voice raspy from the dry air. "It is 110 degrees outside. The asphalt is literally bubbling in the cul-de-sac. Can we maybe have this conversation inside? Or perhaps via email? Or never?" "The aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood is not contingent on the weather, Dave," she snapped, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses. "You are in direct violation of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Those things on your roof, they are an eyesore. They ruin the sightlines. They look like spaceships." I blinked. I actually physically blinked at the sheer absurdity of the statement. I stepped back, gesturing broadly up at my 2-story, stucco-clad, vaguely Mediterranean-style tract home. "Spaceships? Brenda, what kind of low-budget 1950s sci-fi movies are you watching? They are flat rectangles of glass and silicon. They are entirely black. My roof is dark gray. You can only see them if you stand exactly where you are standing right now, at the very edge of my driveway, and squint. It doesn't matter if I have to hang upside down from a traffic light to see them, she countered, crossing her arms. They alter the uniform character of Desert Bloom. We worked very hard to cultivate a specific look for this community, a rustic, desert chic aesthetic. We live in a suburb built in 2004, Brenda, I said, my patience officially evaporating faster than the sweat on my arms. Not a 19th century colonial village. We have a golf course that consumes 1 million gallons of water a day in the middle of a desert. There is nothing rustic about this. It's glass. It generates electricity from the giant fireball currently attempting to cook us alive. It's saving me hundreds of dollars. Your personal finances are not the concern of the HOA board, she said smugly. She shoved the laminated pink slip under my nose again. This time I took it, mostly just to get the glare out of my eyes. Read it, Dave. Article 7, Section B. It's highlighted. I looked down. Sure enough, there was a streak of neon yellow highlighter across a paragraph of dense, legalese-heavy text, and I read it aloud, my voice dripping with disdain. No photovoltaic arrays, wind turbines, or other visible electricity-generating structures shall be permitted on any residential structure. Roofing materials must be restricted to approved terracotta tile, architectural asphalt shingle, or metal. No exceptions without unanimous board approval. You didn't submit an architectural variance request, Dave, Brenda said, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. You just went ahead and bolted an alien landing pad to your house. So, as of tomorrow, you will be fined $50 a day until the structure is restored to its original, approved condition. If the fines reach $1,000, we will place a lien on your property. We will foreclose, Dave. Don't think we won't. She smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered a wounded gazelle in the Serengeti, assuming the Serengeti had manicured HOA, approved xeriscaping. She turned on her heel, her wedges clicking sharply against the concrete, and marched back across the street to her impeccably beige house. I stood there in the driveway for a long time. I looked at the pink slip. I looked at my house. I looked back at the pink slip. The rational part of my brain was screaming in frustration. $50 a day. A lien on my house, over glass panels that were practically invisible. I felt the hot, prickly rush of genuine anger blooming in my chest. I wanted to yell. I wanted to march over to her house and stick the laminated citation into her pristine xeriscaping. But then, as I read the highlighted text for the third time, the anger slowly, beautifully, began to curdle into something else, something much more dangerous. Inspiration. I read the specific phrasing again. Roofing materials must be restricted to approved terracotta tile, architectural asphalt shingle, or metal. I didn't get mad. I got a brilliant, terrible, utterly destructive idea. I looked directly at an imaginary camera in my mind, the one I always envision when the universe hands me a perfect setup for sovereign justice. Game on, Brenda. The very next morning, the neighborhood was treated to a highly confusing spectacle. A crew of 4 guys in high-visibility shirts showed up at my house at 7 a.m. They set up ladders, strapped on safety harnesses, and began the meticulous, painful process of unbolting my brand-new, perfectly functional solar panels. I didn't stay inside. Oh no. I set up a lawn chair on my front porch and poured myself a massive tumbler of iced coffee and sat there watching them work. I made sure to look incredibly, almost psychopathically cheerful. I waved enthusiastically at every car that drove by. When Brenda inevitably came out to retrieve her morning paper, wearing a matching silk robe, naturally, I stood up, grinned like an idiot, and gave her 2 massive thumbs up. She paused at the end of her driveway, clutching the Wall Street Journal. She looked at the guys on the roof, then looked at me. She looked confused, maybe even a little disappointed that I had caved so quickly, without a drawn-out, dramatic fight at a board meeting. I just smiled wider and took a loud sip of my coffee. She gave a curt nod of approval and went back inside. The guys finished by noon, carefully stacking the expensive panels in my garage. But it cost me $500 to have them removed, which stung. But I considered it an investment in the greatest theatrical production Desert Bloom had ever seen. Once they were gone, leaving my roof a barren, dark gray expanse of perfectly normal HOA-approved asphalt shingles, I went inside and fired up my computer. It was time for the research phase. It was time to build a weapon. I spent the next 48 hours doing nothing but drinking black coffee and reading legal statutes. I pulled up the entire, unabridged document of the Desert Bloom HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I cross-referenced it with Scottsdale City ordinances, Maricopa County building codes, and, most importantly, the Arizona revised statutes. I started with the solar panels. It took me less than 2 hours to confirm what I already suspected. And the HOA's outright ban on my solar array was entirely, hilariously illegal. I pulled up Arizona Revised Statute Section 33-439, the state's Solar Rights Act. It was crystal clear. Any covenant, restriction, or condition contained in any deed, contract, or security agreement that effectively prohibits the installation or use of a solar energy device is void and unenforceable. Period. The state legislature essentially declared that in a state made entirely of sunshine, HOAs cannot stop you from harvesting it. Brenda's pink slip wasn't worth the plastic it was laminated in. Her threat to foreclose on my house was legally toothless. I could have hired a lawyer, drafted a cease and desist letter, dragged the HOA board into civil court, and forced them to back down. I would win. But here's the problem with the legal system. It is painfully slow and incredibly boring. Filing a lawsuit meant months of mediation, endless emails from attorneys charging $300 an hour, and a quiet, paperwork-heavy resolution. That wasn't my style. That wasn't the brand. I didn't just want to win on a technicality in a sterile courtroom. I wanted Brenda to feel it. I wanted the entire HOA board to look upon their own arrogance and weep. I needed malicious compliance. I needed to use their own rules to destroy them. So, I abandoned the Solar Rights Act for the moment and went back to the C&Rs. I focused entirely on the sentence Brenda had so helpfully highlighted. Roofing materials must be restricted to approved terracotta tile, architectural asphalt shingle, or metal. Or metal. Those 2 words were a glaring, massive, unpatched vulnerability in the HOA's armor. They had likely included it because standing seam metal roofs are actually quite popular in certain upscale, modern desert architectural designs. They are durable, fire-resistant, and completely standard. But the CC&Rs didn't specify the type of metal. They didn't specify the finish, the gauge, or the reflectivity. They just said metal. I started researching energy efficiency. If I couldn't generate my own electricity to lower my AC bill, I was going to find the most aggressive way possible to reflect the sun's heat away from my house. I fell down a rabbit hole of Federal Department of Energy guidelines regarding cool roofs. The science is simple. Dark roofs absorb solar radiation and transfer that heat into the attic, forcing the HVAC system to work harder. As cool roofs utilize high albedo surfaces, materials with extremely high solar reflectance and thermal emittance, to bounce the sun's rays back into the atmosphere. The most efficient cool roof you can possibly build? A mirror. I opened a new tab and searched for wholesale industrial metal suppliers in the greater Phoenix area. I didn't want standard galvanized steel. I didn't want brushed aluminum. I wanted something that would never tarnish, never rust, and would hold a polish so perfect it would rival the Hubble Space Telescope. I found exactly what I was looking for: T304 stainless steel. But not just standard T304. I needed the specific finish designation. I typed in T304 stainless steel, number 8, mirror finish. The number 8 finish is the highest polish available for stainless steel, and it is achieved by mechanically polishing the metal with successively finer abrasives until all grit lines are removed, followed by extensive buffing to create a flawless, highly reflective, mirror-like surface. It is typically used for clean rooms, high-end commercial kitchen backsplashes, and decorative architectural trim on skyscrapers. I calculated the square footage of my roof: 2,500 square feet. I looked at the price per square foot for number 8 mirror-polished stainless steel sheeting. I did the math. The final number made my eyes water. It was going to cost me nearly 3 times what the solar panels had cost. It was a financially ruinous decision. It was absolute madness. I pulled out my credit card. Just as I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Mike's Roofing and Exterior Solutions. Mike was the guy who had originally inspected my roof when I bought the place, a grizzled, leather-skinned Arizona native who had probably been hammering shingles since the Carter administration. He was the kind of contractor who communicated primarily in grunts, sighs, and brutally honest price estimates. He didn't care about HOA aesthetics. He cared about structural integrity and getting paid on time. I tapped the call button and listened to it ring, staring out my window at Brenda's perfectly manicured, utterly defenseless front yard. "Mike's Roofing. This is Mike," a gruff voice answered, followed immediately by the sound of a nail gun firing 3 times in rapid succession in the background. "Hey, Mike? It's Dave from over in the Desert Bloom subdivision. You looked at my underlayment a few years back." Desert Bloom, Mike muttered, the name leaving his mouth like a bad taste. "Right. The beige prison camp. You got a leak, Dave? Monsoon season is a month away. My schedule is getting tight." "No leak, Mike. I need a whole new roof." There was a pause on the line, just the sound of wind and distant traffic. "A new roof? Dave, your asphalt shingles have another 15 years on them. Easy. I told you that when you bought the place. Unless a meteor hit your house this morning, you don't need a new roof." "I know I don't need one functionally," I explained, leaning back in my office chair and spinning a pen across my knuckles. "But I have let's call it an aesthetic compliance issue with the Homeowners Association. I need to change my roofing material to meet their specific guidelines." Mike groaned loudly. "God, I hate HOAs. Let me guess. Your shingles are the wrong shade of desert sand, and you need to switch to Navajo white, or they're going to fine you to death." "Something like that. They forced me to take down my solar panels, told me they ruined the aesthetic, but their bylaws explicitly state that approved roofing materials include tile, asphalt, or metal." "So you want to go to a standing seam metal roof?" Mike asked, his tone shifting from annoyed to businesslike. "It's a good choice. Great for reflecting heat. We do a lot of corrugated steel, galvanized aluminum. You want a matte finish? Maybe a nice dark bronze to match the stucco?" "No, Mike. I said, a slow smile creeping across my face. I don't want a matte finish. Yeah, I want T304 stainless steel. The nail gun in the background stopped entirely. T304? Stainless? For a residential roof? Dave, that's heavy commercial material. Usually only see that on industrial processing plants or high-end custom architectural builds. It's overkill, and it's expensive as hell. I know it is, I replied. But wait, it gets better. I don't just want standard T304. I need it in a number 8 mirror finish. There was absolute dead silence on the phone for what felt like 10 solid seconds. I thought we might have been disconnected. Mike, you still there? Dave, Mike said slowly, his voice dropping an octave. You want to roof a 2,500 square foot house in mirrored stainless steel? Are you building a laser weapon, son? I laughed, a genuine, slightly manic laugh. I'm building a CC and R compliant architectural masterpiece, Mike. I'm building a monument to energy efficiency and malicious compliance. Dave, listen to me, Mike said, sounding like a disappointed father trying to talk his kid out of a bad tattoo. A number 8 finish is practically a bathroom mirror. Do you have any idea what that is going to do in the Arizona sun? The glare is going to be astronomical. It's going to look like a freshly polished UFO landed on your house. It's going to blind low-flying aircraft. Sky Harbor Airport might reroute traffic. I have done the math, Mike. It is going to be spectacular. The HOA demanded I remove my solar panels because they were an eyesore, but they approved metal roofs. I am simply following their rules to the absolute, blindingly literal letter. And I want the highest albedo surface legally possible. So the question isn't why. The question is, can you do it? Mike sighed, a long, rattling exhale that conveyed decades of dealing with crazy homeowners. Yeah, I can do it. I can source the sheet metal from a commercial supplier down in Phoenix. We'll have to custom fabricate the flashing and the ridge caps. The installation is going to be a nightmare. We can't scratch it, so my guys are going to have to work like they're handling museum artifacts. And I'm going to have to charge you a massive premium, Dave. This isn't just slapping down tar paper and nailing shingles. This is precision sheet metal work. Name your price, Mike. I'm serious. I will wire you a 50% deposit the second you email me the invoice, but I need it done fast. Every day those solar panels are sitting in my garage. My blood pressure goes up. I heard the rustle of paper on Mike's end. All right, crazy man. I'll call my supplier. But I'm writing an ironclad waiver into this contract. When your neighbors sue you because your house melted their retinas, my company is completely indemnified. You are on your own. Deal, I said, grinning from ear to ear. I wouldn't have it any other way. The next 3 weeks were an exercise in excruciating anticipation. While Mike waited for the specialty steel to be milled, shipped, and custom cut to the dimensions of my roof, I lived my life in desert bloom as the model resident. I mowed my lawn to exactly 1.5 inches. I kept my garbage cans hidden behind the side gate. I smiled at Brenda every time I saw her. A wide, almost vacuous smile that seemed to unnerve her more than outright hostility. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully disciplined a rogue element in her pristine, beige kingdom. She had no idea she was currently standing at ground zero. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late June, the trucks arrived. It wasn't just a standard flatbed delivering bundles of shingles. It was 2 massive commercial flatbed 18-wheelers. They pulled into the cul-de-sac with the loud hiss of air brakes, dwarfing the surrounding houses. The neighborhood, which usually consisted of nothing but the sound of distant landscaping equipment and pool pumps, suddenly ground to a halt. Doors cracked open. Curtains twitched. I walked out my front door holding my morning coffee, watching as the drivers hopped out and began unstrapping the load. And the material didn't look like roofing. It was stacked on massive, reinforced wooden pallets, and every single inch of it was wrapped in a thick, opaque, sky blue protective film. It looked like they were delivering sections of a particle accelerator. Mike pulled up a few minutes later in his battered Ford F250, accompanied by a crew of 6 guys. They didn't look like typical roofers today. They looked nervous. "All right, Dave," Mike said, walking up my driveway and eyeing the massive pallets. "Here's the payload. 3 tons of T304 stainless, polished to perfection. And let me tell you, the supplier thought I was out of my mind. We're going to have to start right now, and we're going to have to work fast. The sun is already brutal." Across the street, Brenda's front door swung open. She marched down her driveway, and her eyes fixed on the massive semi-trucks blocking the road. She was wearing her serious business expression, her lips pursed so tightly they practically disappeared. "Dave," she called out, crossing the street without looking for traffic. "What is the meaning of this? You are blocking the entire cul-de-sac. Those trucks exceed the community weight limit guidelines." "Morning, Brenda," I chirped, taking a sip of my coffee. "Just getting a new roof put on. Don't worry, the trucks will be gone in an hour once they unload." She stopped at the edge of my property line, eyeing the blue-wrapped pallets suspiciously. "A new roof? Your current roof is fine. What exactly is that material? It doesn't look like approved architectural shingles." "It's metal, Brenda," I said, gesturing to the pallets. "Well, 100% compliant with Article 7, Section B of the Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. You know, the clause you highlighted for me? I decided to upgrade. Energy efficiency and all that." She narrowed her eyes, trying to see through the thick blue plastic film. "Metal? Well, I suppose metal is permitted, as long as it maintains the rustic, desert chic aesthetic." "Oh, it's very chic," I assured her. "The most chic metal you can buy. Wait until you see it." She gave a dismissive huh, turned around, and marched back to her house, completely unaware that she had just authorized the construction of a neighborhood-destroying superweapon. The tear-off of my old asphalt shingles took 2 days. It was loud, dirty work, but Mike's crew was efficient. By Thursday morning, my house was stripped down to the wooden decking and covered in a high-temperature underlayment designed to withstand extreme thermal loads. And then, the real work began. Because the stainless steel panels were highly susceptible to scratching during installation, the crew couldn't just throw them around. Each panel had to be carefully carried up the ladders by 2 men, aligned with mathematical precision, and secured using specialized, concealed fasteners that wouldn't compromise the mirror finish. The sky blue protective film had to remain on the metal until the very last possible second to protect it from tool marks and scuffs. It took them a full week to install the panels. My house looked bizarre, covered entirely in bright blue plastic like a giant, oddly shaped swimming pool. The HOA board members would occasionally drive by, slowing down to stare. But since the CC&Rs didn't regulate the color of temporary protective construction materials, there was nothing they could do. I was strictly within my rights. Finally, the day of the reveal arrived. It was mid-July. The high for the day was predicted to be 114 degrees. The sky was a pale, cloudless, violently bright blue. There was no wind. It was the kind of day in Arizona where you don't go outside unless your life depends on it. Mike knocked on my door at 8 a.m. He and his crew were standing in my driveway. They looked like they were preparing for a spacewalk. Every single one of them was wearing heavy, long sleeves, thick gloves, and most tellingly, dark welding goggles. "This is it, Dave," Mike said, his voice muffled behind a bandana he had tied over his face. We're going to pull the film. We start at the top ridge and work our way down. Once that plastic comes off, there is no going back. You sure you want to do this? I handed Mike a pair of polarized, mirrored aviator sunglasses I had bought specifically for this occasion. Mike, I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. Light it up. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, walked down to the end of the cul-de-sac to get a full view, and put my sunglasses on. Mike and his men climbed the ladders. They positioned themselves along the peak of the roof. Mike gave a hand signal, and they all grabbed the edge of the blue plastic film. "Pull!" Mike yelled. They ripped the film backward in one synchronized motion. The effect was not gradual. It was instantaneous, and it was devastating, as the blue plastic peeled away, exposing the pristine, a flawless number 8, mirror finish of the T304 stainless steel. It was as if a second sun had suddenly materialized on the surface of the earth. The light didn't just reflect, it exploded. A blinding, searing, solid beam of pure solar energy ricocheted off the angled surface of my roof and struck the neighborhood with the force of a physical blow. I actually gasped and stumbled backward. Even through the heavy polarization of my aviator sunglasses, the glare was excruciating. It was impossible to look directly at the house. My home had ceased to be a structure of wood and stucco. It had transformed into a glowing, featureless geometric anomaly of pure, white-hot light. Mike's crew, protected by their welding goggles, scrambled down the ladders as fast as they safely could, abandoning the roof like it was a sinking ship. Then they practically ran to their trucks, throwing the wadded-up blue plastic into the beds. "Holy Mother of God," Mike breathed, pulling off his bandana and squinting through his goggles. He was sweating profusely, his face pale. "Dave, you actually did it. You weaponized your house." I couldn't speak. I was too busy watching the immediate, catastrophic fallout. Because my house faced south, the primary angle of the roof was perfectly positioned to catch the morning and midday sun. And because of the pitch of the roof, that light wasn't bouncing harmlessly back into the sky. It was being directed straight across the street, in a concentrated parabolic beam, directly into the front yard of Brenda's house. The sensory details of that moment are burned into my memory. The ambient temperature in the cul-de-sac seemed to jump 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The air itself felt thick, radiating a dry, oppressive heat that made the inside of my nose burn. The glare was so intense that it cast sharp, unnatural double shadows on the pavement. A FedEx delivery truck turned into the cul-de-sac. The driver made it about 50 feet before he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I watched him throw his arm over his face, completely blinded by the reflection off my roof. He threw the truck into reverse and hastily backed out of the street, unwilling to proceed. Then, the true collateral damage began. Brenda was incredibly proud of her front yard, while the rest of us had standard desert xeriscaping, rocks, a few cacti. There's maybe a resilient mesquite tree. Brenda had insisted on maintaining a lush, water-intensive garden of delicate, imported flora. Right in the center of her lawn, directly in the path of the new death ray, was a custom-built wooden trellis supporting a massive, prize-winning collection of rare cymbidium orchids. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as the concentrated beam of mirrored sunlight hit the orchids. It wasn't a slow process. Within 5 minutes, the delicate, waxy petals began to curl at the edges. 10 minutes later, they were visibly browning, the moisture being violently evaporated out of them. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a drought, sped up by 1,000%. Suddenly, Brenda's front door flew open. She stepped out onto her porch, holding a watering can. She took one step, and then stopped dead. The beam of light hit her perfectly crisp, pastel yellow capri set, illuminating her like an actor on a stage under a high-intensity follow spot. She dropped the watering can. It clattered against the concrete, water spilling out and instantly beginning to steam. She threw both hands over her eyes, letting out a shriek that was half surprise, half genuine pain. "My eyes!" she screamed, stumbling backward into her front door. "What is that? What is happening?" She blindly fumbled for the doorknob, wrenched the door open, and vanished into the safety of her house, slamming the door shut behind her. I stood there, adjusting my aviators, a profound sense of peace washing over me. The heat was unbearable, the light was blinding, and my house looked like a malfunctioning satellite. But as I watched Brenda's prized orchids spontaneously dehydrate, I knew that every single penny I had spent on that T304 stainless steel had been worth it. Mike walked up next to me, still wearing his welding goggles. He looked at my glowing house, then looked across the street at Brenda's wilting garden. He slowly shook his head. "You're a monster, Dave," Mike said, a distinct note of reverence in his voice. "A brilliant, vindictive monster. I'm going to send you the final invoice. If you need me, I'll be in a dark room with an ice pack over my eyes." "Thanks, Mike," I said, not taking my eyes off the destruction. "You did great work." Mike drove away, his crew following quickly behind. The cul-de-sac fell silent, save for the faint, crackling sound of extreme thermal expansion coming from the metallic surface of my roof. And it took exactly 22 minutes for the police to arrive. I was sitting on a lawn chair on my front porch, safely positioned in the shade beneath the eaves, sipping a fresh glass of iced tea. I had moved my chair as far back as possible to avoid the secondary glare bouncing off the driveway. A white Maricopa County Sheriff's cruiser turned the corner. Just like the FedEx driver, the deputy hit the brakes hard as soon as my house came into view. The cruiser sat idling at the entrance to the cul-de-sac for a long moment. Finally, it crept forward at a crawl, the driver keeping the car tight against the opposite curb, trying to use the shade of a large mesquite tree for cover. The cruiser parked in front of Brenda's house. The door opened, and a young deputy stepped out. He immediately threw his hand up like a visor, squinting aggressively at my property. He didn't even try to look directly at the roof. He kept his gaze focused on my front lawn. I stood up, holding my iced tea, and walked down to the edge of my driveway. "Morning, officer. Beautiful day, isn't it?" The deputy, whose name tag read Ramirez, gingerly walked across the street. He was sweating heavily, his dark uniform absorbing the intense ambient heat radiating from the concrete. He stopped a few feet away from me, still shielding his eyes with his hand. "Sir," Deputy Ramirez said, his voice tight, "are you the homeowner of this residence?" "I am indeed," I smiled. "Dave, pleasure to meet you." Ramirez pointed a hesitant finger in the general direction of my roof, refusing to actually look at it. "Sir, your house is glowing. It is actively blinding traffic." "Oh, that," I said dismissively, waving a hand. "That's just my new highly energy-efficient cool roof. It utilizes high-albedo technology to reflect solar radiation, thereby reducing my carbon footprint and lowering the strain on the municipal power grid during peak summer hours. I'm practically an environmentalist." Ramirez stared at me, his eyes watering even though he was looking at my chest. "The lady across the street called 911. She said you built a public hazard. She said you are trying to vaporize her dog." "Vaporize her dog?" I gasped, clutching my pearls. "Officer, I love animals. I would never. The dog is inside. It's the orchids that are taking the brunt of it, unfortunately. But that's just basic physics, really. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection." "Sir," Ramirez said, his patience clearly thinning, You can't have a giant mirror on your roof. It's a traffic hazard. It's a public nuisance. I'm going to have to ask you to cover it up, or paint it, or something." This was the moment. The trap was set, and it was time to spring it. I took a calm sip of my iced tea and pulled a neatly organized manila folder out from under my arm. "Actually, Deputy Ramirez, I'm afraid I can't do that," I said, opening the folder. "You see, painting or covering the roof would alter its aesthetic condition, which is strictly governed by the Desert Bloom Homeowners Association. And as a law-abiding resident, I must adhere to their guidelines." I pulled out the laminated pink citation Brenda had given me weeks ago and handed it to him. "If you look at the highlighted section, officer, you will see that the HOA expressly requires roofing materials to be restricted to approved tile, asphalt shingle, or metal. They forced me to remove my non-reflective solar panels under threat of foreclosure and insisted I install an approved material. So, I hired a licensed contractor and installed a metal roof. A T304 stainless steel metal roof. Here are the city permits, fully approved by the Maricopa County Building Inspector." I handed him a stack of stapled paperwork, stamped and signed by the city. Ramirez took the paperwork, his brow furrowing. He looked at the pink slip. He looked at the city permits. He looked back at me, a slow realization dawning on his face. "You're telling me," Ramirez said, his voice flat, "that the HOA forced you to take down normal solar panels, and so you maliciously complied by legally installing a giant mirror on your house?" "I prefer the term enthusiastically complied, officer," I corrected him. "But yes, everything you see here is 100% legal, permitted, and fully compliant with the binding civil contract I have with the Homeowners Association. I am just following the rules Brenda set for me." Ramirez looked at the paperwork again. He looked across the street at Brenda's house, where she was currently peering out from behind a closed curtain, wearing what looked like a welding mask of her own. He looked back at my house, still shielding his eyes. Slowly, the corners of Ramirez's mouth began to twitch. He handed the paperwork back to me. "Sir," Ramirez said, struggling to maintain his professional composure, "this is entirely a civil matter. Just as long as you have the proper municipal permits, which you do, there is absolutely nothing law enforcement can do about a neighborhood dispute over roofing materials." "That's exactly what I figured," I grinned. Ramirez turned to walk back to his cruiser. He stopped and looked over his shoulder. "For what it's worth, sir," he said, a genuine smirk finally breaking through. "Nice sunglasses. You're going to need them." He walked back across the street. I watched him approach Brenda's front door. He knocked, and she cracked it open, immediately launching into a frantic, high-pitched diatribe. Ramirez just held up a hand, shook his head, and spoke to her for about 30 seconds. I couldn't hear what he said, but the effect was immediate. Brenda's shoulders slumped. She looked utterly defeated. Ramirez tipped his hat. Dad got back in his cruiser and drove away, carefully hugging the shade of the trees as he exited the cul-de-sac. I went back to my porch, sat down in my chair, and put my feet up. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The HOA board was going to lose its collective mind. There would be emergency meetings, angry letters, and threats of litigation. But I had the high ground. Literally. I had the sun on my side, and I had the law on my side. I looked up at the blazing white anomaly sitting on top of my house, casting its righteous, destructive glare across the neighborhood. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The rest of that Tuesday was a masterclass in psychological warfare. As the sun tracked across the brutal Arizona sky, My roof acted as a slow-moving, unyielding spotlight of suburban destruction. By 2 in the afternoon, it was blinding the second-story windows of the houses behind me. By 4, it was creating a localized heat mirage over the community mailbox cluster at the end of the street. My phone started vibrating around noon, and essentially didn't stop. The Desert Bloom neighborhood next-door page, usually a quiet repository for lost cat posters and complaints about trash pickup, turned into a digital war zone. People were posting blurry, overexposed photos of my house, demanding to know if a UFO had crashed. Someone asked if there was a gas leak, causing a visual distortion. Brenda, predictably, was furiously tagging the official Scottsdale City accounts, demanding a SWAT team or a tactical airstrike. I just sat in my beautifully air-conditioned living room, watching my smart meter spin slower and slower as the ultimate cool roof deflected 98% of the sun's thermal energy away from my attic. At exactly 6 o'clock, the sun finally dipped below the McDowell Mountains, and the blinding glare faded into a dull, slightly menacing metallic glow. 10 minutes later, I heard the aggressive, staccato marching of heels on my front walkway. I didn't even have to look at the security camera to know who it was. I opened the door before she could knock. Brenda was standing there, and she looked like she had aged 5 years in 8 hours. She was holding a clipboard tightly to her chest, her knuckles white. She was still wearing a pair of massive, dark sunglasses, even though it was dusk. Her usually pristine hair was slightly frizzy from the ambient humidity of her boiled orchids. "Emergency board meeting," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and profound dehydration. "Tonight, 8 p.m., Community Clubhouse. Your presence is mandatory, Dave." "An emergency meeting?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe and feigning surprise. "Brenda, is everything okay? You look a little flushed. Did you forget your sunscreen today?" "Do not play games with me," she snapped, shoving a piece of paper against my chest. "You have endangered this entire community. You have weaponized your property. We are taking legal action. 8 p.m. Be there, or we will vote in your absence and slap a lien on your house so fast it will make your head spin." She turned and marched away. I looked at the paper. It was a formal summons, printed on the official Desert Bloom letterhead. I smiled, went back inside, and took a quick shower. I put on a crisp button-down shirt and my favorite pair of slacks. If you're going to completely dismantle a petty local government, you should dress for the occasion. The community clubhouse was a generic, stucco building situated next to the neighborhood pool. It always smelled faintly of chlorine and cheap commercial carpet cleaner. When I walked through the double-glass doors at 5 minutes to 8, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a machete. The entire HOA board was sitting behind a long, folding table at the front of the room. Brenda was in the center, flanked by Gary, the aggressively sweaty community treasurer who always wore golf shirts tucked into khaki shorts, and Susan, the secretary, who looked like she was permanently smelling something foul. Behind them, about 30 residents had crammed into the folding chairs, murmuring anxiously. When I walked in, the room went dead silent. Heads swiveled. A few people actually glared at me. I walked straight to the front row, pulled out a metal folding chair, and sat down directly facing Brenda. I crossed my legs, folded my hands in my lap, and gave her a polite, expectant nod. "Let's get this over with," Brenda said, slamming a wooden gavel onto the plastic table. It sounded more like a hollow thud than a commanding crack, which perfectly set the tone for what was about to happen. "This emergency meeting of the Desert Bloom Homeowners Association is called to order. The sole item on the agenda is the immediate, unmitigated disaster currently residing at Dave's property. It's a roof, Brenda, I interjected smoothly. And a highly efficient one. It is a public hazard, Gary yelled, his face turning the color of a ripe tomato. He leaned forward, pointing a thick, stubby finger at me. I drove past your house at 3 o'clock, Dave. I had to pull over because I literally could not see the road. You are going to cause a fatal traffic accident. You are going to burn someone's house down. I assure you, Gary, the focal point of the reflection is not concentrated enough to ignite building materials, I replied calmly. I checked the math. It will certainly dehydrate sensitive plant life, but it won't start a fire. It is completely safe. And more importantly, it is completely permitted by the city of Scottsdale. We don't care about the city, Brenda shouted, losing whatever thin veneer of professionalism she was trying to maintain. We care about the CC&Rs. You are in gross violation of the community standards. Am I? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out my heavily tabbed copy of the bylaws. Susan, you're the secretary. Could you do me a favor and read Article 7, Section B, Paragraph 2 aloud for the room, just so we are all on the same page? Susan looked at Brenda nervously. Brenda scowled, but gave a stiff nod. Susan cleared her throat, adjusted her reading glasses, and began to read. Roofing materials must be restricted to approved terracotta tile, architectural asphalt shingle, or metal. No exceptions without unanimous board approval. I let the words hang in the air for a few seconds. The hum of the clubhouse air conditioning seemed incredibly loud. Or metal, I repeated softly. You forced me, under threat of severe financial penalty and foreclosure, to remove my solar panels. You stated they were an unapproved structure. You explicitly commanded me to install an approved roofing material. I chose metal, specifically T304 stainless steel with a number 8 mirror finish. It is metal. It is on my roof. Therefore, it is compliant. It's a mirror, Gary bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. You put a giant mirror on your house. That's not what the bylaws mean, and you know it, you smug son of a gun. The bylaws do not specify the gauge, the alloy, or the finish of the metal, Gary, I shot back, my voice hardening just a fraction. They say metal. I am following the letter of the law you enforce so ruthlessly. Furthermore, as I explained to the sheriff's deputy today, who, by the way, and confirmed I am breaking no laws, I am simply adhering to Federal Department of Energy guidelines regarding high-albedo cool roofs. Since you forced me to stop generating my own clean energy, I had to find a way to maximize my home's thermal efficiency. I am saving the planet, Gary. You should be thanking me. The crowd behind me erupted into chaotic muttering. A few people were laughing, actually realizing the sheer, absurd maliciousness of what I had done. But the board wasn't laughing. Enough! Brenda screamed, banging her sad gavel again. This is cute, Dave. You think you found a clever little loophole? But you haven't. The board has broad discretionary power regarding aesthetic harmony. We are retroactively denying your roof. You have 48 hours to paint it a matte, HOA-approved desert sand color. Or we will hire a crew to do it for you and bill you for the labor, on top of a $500 a day fine. Ah, I said, leaning forward. There it is, the overreach. I was waiting for that. I stood up. I walked slowly over to the folding table, placed my hands flat on the cheap plastic, and leaned in close to Brenda. You aren't going to paint my roof, Brenda. You aren't going to fine me. And you definitely aren't going to place a lien on my house. Watch me, she spat. I don't have to, I said, my voice dropping to a low, conversational volume that somehow carried to the very back of the room. Because if you touch my property, or if you attempt to levy a single cent in fines against me, I will file a lawsuit that will personally bankrupt you, Gary, Susan, and every single resident in this room." The room went dead silent again. Gary scoffed, but he looked nervous. "You can't sue us for enforcing the rules." "I absolutely can," I said, standing up straight and addressing the entire room. "Because your initial enforcement was illegal. You see, when Brenda handed me that pink slip demanding I remove my solar panels, she committed an act of tortious interference and fraud." I pulled another document from my portfolio. It was printed on heavy legal weight paper. "This," I said, holding it up, "is Arizona Revised Statute Section 33-439. The Arizona Solar Rights Act. It is a state law, signed by the governor, which explicitly states that any HOA covenant, restriction, or condition that effectively prohibits the installation or use of a solar energy device is entirely void and legally unenforceable." I tossed the statute onto the table in front of Brenda. She stared at it like it was a live grenade. "You had no legal authority to demand the removal of my panels," I continued, pacing slowly in front of the table. "Your CC&Rs regarding solar energy are illegal in the state of Arizona. You used the threat of foreclosure, which you could not legally execute, to extort me into removing a protected energy device. That is coercion. That is fraud." I stopped and looked directly at Gary. "So I removed them. I complied with your illegal demand, and at great personal expense, I installed a metal roof that strictly complies with your poorly written, legally binding bylaws. If you try to force me to paint it, and thereby reducing its energy efficiency, you are once again violating my property rights. If you take me to court over this shiny roof, my countersuit will bring this state statute directly to a judge. The judge will look at your illegal ban on solar panels, look at your extortion tactics, and award me the cost of the solar panels, the cost of the stainless steel roof, punitive damages, and all of my attorney's fees. The HOA's insurance policy won't cover willful violation of state law. This community will be drained of its reserves, and then they will come for your personal assets." I let the reality of the situation sink in. You could literally hear the blood draining from Gary's face. Susan looked like she was going to be sick. Brenda was staring blankly at the statute on the table, her mouth slightly open. The residents in the crowd were looking at the board with a mixture of shock and dawning fury. They realized that Brenda's petty tyranny was about to cost them money. You set us up," Brenda whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just followed your rules to their logical, blinding conclusion," I corrected her gently. "You wanted aesthetic harmony. You wanted absolute control. You just forgot to check if your control was legal." I sat back down in my metal folding chair and crossed my legs again. "Now," I said cheerfully, "I am a reasonable man. I do not want to live in a house that requires welding goggles to check the mail. I don't want to vaporize any more of your orchids, Brenda. So I am willing to offer the board a settlement." Gary practically lunged across the table. "What do you want?" "It's simple," I outlined. I'm ticking the points off on my fingers. "First, the HOA will cut me a check for the exact cost of the materials and labor required to install and subsequently remove the T304 stainless steel roof. I have the invoices right here. It's a large number, Gary. Don't gasp. Second, the HOA will pay my contractor, Mike, to pull the solar panels out of my garage and reinstall them on my roof. Third, and most importantly, the board will draft and sign a legally binding, perpetual, and irrevocable waiver stating that my property is exempt from all current and future aesthetic guidelines regarding the installation, maintenance, and appearance of any energy-generating or energy-saving devices. I want it notarized." Brenda looked up at me, her eyes flashing with a desperate, dying ember of defiance. We don't have that kind of money in the discretionary fund, Dave. That metal roof cost a fortune." "Then you better dip into the emergency reserve," I smiled. "Because the alternative is I leave the mirror up, the neighborhood slowly goes blind, property values plummet to zero because nobody wants to buy a house next to the sun, and then I sue you all into oblivion anyway. It's your call, Brenda. You have 5 minutes to vote." I didn't even need 5 minutes. The crowd behind me practically rioted. A man in the third row yelled, "Pay the man, Brenda, you idiot!" Another woman shouted that if they didn't sign the waiver, she was calling a lawyer to dissolve the HOA entirely. The illusion of Brenda's power was completely shattered. She wasn't the queen of Desert Bloom anymore. She was a massive liability. Gary and Susan didn't even consult her. They aggressively whispered to each other for 30 seconds. Then Gary raised his hand. "I motion to accept Dave's terms," Gary said, his voice trembling slightly. "I second," Susan said instantly. They looked at Brenda. She looked at the crowd, then back at me. I just gave her a polite, close-lipped smile. She picked up her sad little wooden gavel, her hand shaking. "All in favor," she choked out. "Aye," Gary and Susan said in unison. "Motion passes," Brenda whispered. She didn't bang the gavel. She just let it slip out of her hand and roll across the table. The aftermath was incredibly swift and intensely satisfying. The very next morning, Mike and his crew arrived back at my house. When I handed Mike the check, signed directly by the Desert Bloom Homeowners Association, and he laughed so hard he had to sit down on the tailgate of his truck. "I have been doing this for 40 years, Dave," Mike wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "I have seen a lot of crazy homeowners, but you are an artist. A terrifying, beautiful artist." Taking the stainless steel down was much easier than putting it up. They didn't have to be careful about scratching it anymore. They just unbolted the blinding panels, stacked them on the flatbed, and hauled them away to be sold for scrap metal. By Friday afternoon, my standard dark gray asphalt shingles were exposed once more, and my sleek, black-on-black monocrystalline solar panels were firmly bolted back into place, silently soaking up the harsh Arizona sun and spinning my electric meter backward. The neighborhood returned to normal, mostly, and the ambient temperature in the cul-de-sac dropped. The mail carrier stopped wearing polarized sunglasses, but things were distinctly different. Brenda rarely came outside anymore. When she did, she avoided looking at my house entirely. The remains of her orchid trellis had been quietly dismantled and hauled away by a landscaping crew. At the next HOA board meeting, a group of residents initiated a recall vote. Brenda stepped down before they could officially oust her, citing health reasons. The new board president was a relaxed, retired guy named Phil, who essentially ignored the CC and Rs as long as you didn't park a rusted-out school bus on your lawn. As for me, I was sitting exactly where I started. It was late August, the temperature was a blistering 112 degrees, and I was sitting on my front porch, was drinking an iced coffee. My AC was humming beautifully in the background, keeping my house at a frosty 70 degrees. I opened the utility app on my phone and checked my current electric bill. $12.40. I looked up at my roof. The panels were barely visible, just flat rectangles of glass silently doing their job. I looked across the street at Brenda's empty beige yard. This is why you have to read the fine print, folks. The people who write these rules, the neighborhood tyrants, the middle management dictators, the people who thrive on aggressively laminating their petty demands, they rely on your ignorance. They rely on the fact that you won't do the research, that you'll just roll over and accept the fine to avoid the conflict. But the moment you turn their own bloated, poorly written rules against them, of the moment you introduce them to the blinding light of malicious compliance, they crumble. Always know your rights. Always check the state statutes. And never, ever let them tell you what you can't do with your own sunshine. Stay sovereign.